The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. Outside the blinds, the parking lot lights were just starting to flicker on. Inside, I was sitting across the table from two people who had spent 11 years taking apart families like mine, piece by piece, and neither of them had the decency to look ashamed of it. They didn't know yet how much I understood. Not fully, not with the folder still closed on the table in front of me, not with Sergeant Pierce standing by the door with his arms crossed and his eyes on Preston like he was already measuring him for a pair of handcuffs. Deborah Ashford sat with her hands folded, playing the wounded matriarch, even now, even here. Preston wouldn't look at me at all. He was studying the wood grain of the table like it owed him an explanation he hadn't worked out yet. I laid the folder open just enough to see the first few lines of names typed down the left margin. More names than I expected. More than I think I could have prepared myself for if anyone had warned me. I closed it again and set my hands down flat on top of it, the same way I used to set them flat on a bleeding soldier's chest when I needed him to see that mine weren't shaking, even on the nights when they were. 11 years, I said. The word landed heavier than I expected it to. Deborah's chin lifted half an inch. Preston's jaw went tight. That's how long the two of you have been doing this, I said. So I have one question before anyone in this room says another word. How many of us were there before me? Nobody answered. Down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. Sergeant Pierce shifted his weight but didn't speak. He was letting me have this. I looked at Preston, my late husband's son. A boy I had once bandaged a skinned knee for a man I had trusted enough to sign my whole life over to 2 years ago without reading past the second page, and I waited. He still didn't look up. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know either of their names would end up carved into the worst chapter of my life. 3 weeks ago, I thought I already knew exactly what my worst chapter looked like. I'd survived it once, a long time ago, in a place with sand instead of carpet. I was wrong. There was a worse one waiting for me at home. 3 weeks earlier, my alarm went off at 5 in the morning, the way it always did, and the way it had every morning for 2 years. I was already awake before it rang. 25 push-ups, 60 crunches. My knees complained more than they used to, and my shoulders reminded me every single day that I wasn't 40 anymore, but I did them anyway on the thin carpet of a room the brochure called a private suite, and I privately called a cell with better lighting. My name is Hannah Freeman. I spent 26 years in the United States Army Nurse Corps, 2 tours in Iraq, and more nights than I can count with my hands buried in wounds that would have killed a lesser body than the ones God gave the men and women I served beside. I retired a full colonel. I raised a daughter mostly alone after my first husband died young, and I found love again at 51 with a good man named Walter Freeman, who left this world 3 years ago and left me without ever meaning to at the mercy of his son. None of that mattered to the girl doing the morning medication rounds at Bellhaven Senior Living. To her, I was room 114, a sweet old lady who buttoned her cardigans to the top and asked too many questions. That morning, the girl was a new one. Paige, her name tag said. 23, maybe 24, with the particular nervous energy of someone 3 weeks out of nursing school who didn't yet trust her own hands. She knocked once and came in before I could answer, which I let go because I remembered what it felt like to be new somewhere. The stakes were high and nobody had the patience to be gentle with you. "Morning, Sorry, Mrs. Freeman," she said, already flustered, already reaching for the little paper cup of pills on my nightstand. "Time for your—" "That's not mine," I said. "That's Mr. Delgado's insulin. You've got our chart switched again." She froze with the cup halfway to my hand. "Room 114 is metformin once daily with breakfast," I said, keeping my voice level the way you keep it level for someone about to realize what they nearly did. "Give a hypoglycemic man an insulin dose meant for a sliding scale type 2, and he's in a coma before his oatmeal gets cold. Check your chart. Then go check on him because I want to know this didn't happen to him first." Her face went the color of the wall. "Oh my God, you're right, I need to—" "Go," I said. "Now. Thank me later." I heard her shoes slapping the linoleum all the way down the hall. I sat back down on the edge of my bed, finished tying my second shoe, and thought not for the first time that the people who ran this place had decided somewhere along the way that gray hair meant a person had stopped being able to count. I had counted plenty in my life. Chest compressions, units of blood. Days since I'd last hugged my granddaughter, which that morning stood at 41. That one I tried not to count too closely. It only made the mornings longer. I dressed navy cardigan, the one with the small enamel eagle pin Walter gave me the year we got engaged, and made my way down to the sunroom for the only real appointment left on my calendar. I called my daughter. Denise picked up on the second ring the way she always did when Amara was at school, and the house was quiet enough to hear herself think. "Morning, Mama." "Morning, baby. How's my girl?" "Amara's good. Nervous about a spelling test. I told her she gets that from you. You never met a word you didn't want to pin down and interrogate." I laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that still surprised me some mornings. Tell her interrogate would be a fine word to start with. We talked for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock behind the plastic ficus tree the way I watched everything now, because 11 minutes was what I usually got before Denise had to go, and I'd learned to stretch 11 minutes as far as it would reach. She didn't mention Grant. She rarely did anymore, and I told myself that was simply marriage, the way a grown daughter stops narrating her husband's moods to her mother. I told myself a great many things that year that I shouldn't have. When I hung up, Preston called. He called every Tuesday at 9:15 like a man checking on an investment, rather than a woman who used to clean out his scraped knees when he fell out of trees at 11 years old. Preston Freeman had been 20 when I married his father, and if you'd asked me back then, I would have told you I loved that boy like my own. That was before the folder. 2 years ago, the year after Walter's heart finally gave out for good, Preston had come to me with a folder and a fountain pen, and a voice so gentle I hadn't questioned a word of it. "Just a precaution, Hannah. In case something happens and you can't make decisions for yourself. It protects you." I signed where he pointed. I didn't read past the second page. I had just buried my husband, and my stepson was offering to carry a weight I didn't have the strength to carry alone, and I let him. 6 months later, I was living at Belhaven. My accounts required his signature to touch. Every request I made to visit my daughter, to keep my granddaughter for more than a weekend, to simply leave the building without an escort, went through him first. "Morning, Hannah," Preston said. "Everything good?" "Everything's the same as last Tuesday. I'd like to see my granddaughter this weekend. Let me see what I can do. I've got a lot on my plate." He said some version of that sentence nearly every week. I'd learned not to hope too hard on the weeks he actually delivered. I did not know yet that the plate he had so much on had my name written across it in ink I couldn't see. By the time I made it to the dining hall, Belhaven had its usual rhythm. Mr. Delgado saved twice now from well-meaning chaos holding my seat by the window. Ruth Ann Colby, 91, and sharper than half the staff sliding into the chair across from me with her tray. "You've got your Tuesday face on," she said. "I don't have a Tuesday face. You've had one every Tuesday for a year. I've outlived 3 husbands and a war Hannah Freeman. Don't lie to me before I've had my coffee." I was still laughing when the hallway phone rang at 10:40. I answered out of habit since the front desk girl was on break, and half the residents couldn't hear it from the dining hall anyway. "Belhaven Senior Living, this is Hannah. Is this Hannah Freeman, mother of Denise Ashford?" Something in my chest went very still the way it used to go, still in a field hospital, half a second before I understood exactly how bad the next 10 minutes were going to be. "Speaking. Ma'am, this is Mercy General. Your daughter's been admitted to the emergency department. She had a fall. We need someone to come in." A fall. I had spent 26 years listening to that word. I knew its weight, its shape, the particular hollowness of it when a person says it too fast, like a lie they've been told to memorize. "I'll be there," I said, and my voice came out steady, because that was the one gift my training had ever really given me, the ability to sound calm, exactly when calm was the last thing I felt. I hung up and looked down at my own hands. For the first time in 2 years, they weren't shaking from age. They were shaking from rage. I found the facility director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Whitlock, and told him my daughter was in the hospital and I needed to leave immediately. Of course," he said, already reaching for a clipboard. "I'll just need authorization from Preston, I know." I called him myself. He picked up on the 4th ring later than usual for a Tuesday. "Hannah, I'm actually kind of in the middle of..." "Denise is in the hospital. I need to go. Now." There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. Not a father-in-law's pause. The kind where the air goes out of a man because someone he loves might be hurt. It was a different kind of quiet one I wouldn't understand the shape of for another 3 weeks. Let me make a call first, he said. I'll call you right back. Preston, my daughter is in an emergency room. I know. Give me 10 minutes. He hung up before I could tell him what I thought of his 10 minutes. I did not wait for them. I had one favor left in this world I had never spent, and I spent it that morning without a second thought. I called Mercy General and asked for Dr. Elijah Banks' chief of staff, and when the operator told me he was in a meeting, I said 4 words that had never once failed me in 26 years of service. Tell him it's Kandahar. He called back in 90 seconds. Hannah Freeman, he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. The particular exhausted warmth of a man who has spent 30 years grateful to still be standing. I wondered when you'd cash that one in. I'm cashing it in now, Elijah. My daughter's in your ER. I need out of Belhaven, and I need it to look official because my stepson is about to tell me I have to wait. Say no more. Papers shuffled on his end. I'll have transport there in 30 minutes. Emergency family consult straight from my office. Nobody at that facility is going to argue with that. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Just be careful. And Hannah, whatever's waiting for you over here, you go in like the woman I remember, not the one they've been trying to make you into. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that until much later. At the time, I just said goodbye, hung up, and packed a bag with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Preston called back 19 minutes later. By then, I was standing at the front door in my coat, watching the hospital transport pull into the circular drive. Mr. Whitlock took one look at the paperwork the driver handed him, Dr. Elijah Banks's signature chief of staff, right there in blue ink, and didn't say another word. I walked out of Belhaven for the first time in 2 months without asking anyone's permission. It would not be the last rule I broke that week. The drive to Mercy General took 11 minutes, the same 11 minutes I usually spent on the phone with Denise, and I spent every one of them staring out the window, trying not to imagine all the ways a person falls. I'd seen them all. Falls that were falls. Falls wearing a fall's clothing over something else entirely. I knew the difference the way I knew my own name, and some small, desperate part of me kept trying to talk myself out of what I already suspected, because the alternative was a grief I wasn't ready to carry into that hospital room. I didn't get the choice. The nurse at the station pointed me down the hall without asking who I was. I suppose a 67-year-old woman moving with that kind of purpose doesn't get stopped very often, and I pushed open the door to room 214 and felt my whole chest cave in. My daughter was a map of bruises. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, the skin around it a deep, sick purple that would turn yellow-green in a week if she was lucky enough to heal clean. Her right arm was in a cast from wrist to elbow. There were marks on her neck, 4 small ones, and a thumb the unmistakable shape of a hand that had held on too hard for too long. She'd been quiet when I walked in. The second I said her name, she broke. "Mom?" Her voice cracked clean in half. "It's Grant. He lost at cards again, and he came home, and his mother said I should have been smarter than to spend money on Amara's shoes when he needed it for the game. His mother and his sister, they didn't stop him. They just watched." I felt something inside me go cold and quiet the way it used to go cold and quiet in a triage tent when I needed my hands to work faster than my heart could feel. Grief was for later. Grief was a luxury I'd learned a long time ago not to spend in the moment someone needed me steady. "Look at me," I said. She did. "I am going to fix this." "Mom, no." Her good hand tightened around mine. "You don't understand. Grant's already so angry, and his mother, please. Just stay away from them. I don't want you hurt, too." I leaned down and pressed my lips to the one unbruised patch of her forehead. "Sweetheart," I said, "I have been underestimated by better people than Deborah Ashford. Trust me, I am not the woman they think I am." She searched my face like she was trying to remember a version of her mother from before Belhaven, before the folder and the fountain pen, before 2 years of just in case, had quietly convinced me I needed permission to be strong. I picked up the chart hanging at the foot of her bed while a young resident finished his notes, and I read it the way I'd read 1,000 charts before it. Fractured ulna. 3 fractured ribs, 1 displaced. Mild concussion. Contusions consistent with someone had written fall, and beneath it in smaller letters, repeat injury pattern recommends social work consult. Somebody in this hospital had already seen what I was seeing. "Where's Amara?" I asked. Denise's face crumpled a different way. At the house. With them. That was all I needed. I'm going to your house, I said. I'm going to get my granddaughter, and I'm going to stay there until you're strong enough to come home to a house that's actually safe. Do you understand me? Mom. Denise? I said her name the way I used to say a soldier's name when I needed him to hear the order underneath the care. I raised you. I did not raise you to apologize for surviving something that was done to you. Rest. Let the doctors do their job. I'm going to go do mine. She was still crying when I left, but it was a different kind of crying than the one I'd walked in on the exhausted, disbelieving relief of someone who's just realized help actually arrived. I stopped at the nurse's station on my way out. Has anyone called the police? The charge nurse, a tired-looking woman named Odessa, glanced down the hall before answering low. Your daughter said she didn't want to. Said it'd make things worse at home. We flagged it for social work, but ma'am, without her cooperating, our hands are a little tied. They won't be tied much longer, I said. I walked out of Mercy General with my coat buttoned to the collar and a calm settling over me I hadn't felt in 2 years. It wasn't peace. It was something closer to purpose, and after 2 years of somebody else deciding what I was capable of, purpose felt like coming home. The house on Millbrook Lane looked ordinary enough from the outside vinyl siding, a basketball hoop with no net, a minivan in the driveway that had seen better years. It was what hit me when the door opened that told the real story, the smell. Stale beer-old takeout, something sour underneath that I recognized from conditions I'd rather not remember. Deborah Ashford opened the door before I could knock a second time. Heavy-set, dyed blonde, a cigarette already burning between 2 fingers, though it wasn't even noon. You must be the mother, she said, looking me over the way you'd look over a used car somebody was trying to sell you cheap. Denise didn't say you were coming today. Denise is in the hospital. I'm here for my granddaughter. Well, she stepped back just enough to let me in, not an inch more. She's around somewhere. Try not to track anything in the carpets just got done. The carpets, from what I could see, had not gotten done in this decade. I appreciate you looking after her while Denise recovers. I said, keeping my voice pleasant, because I'd learned a long time ago that the first thing you give someone who underestimates you is exactly the performance they expect. It must be a lot managing a family estate and a grandchild all at once. Deborah's eyes flicked toward me sharper than I expected. It's more manageable than people think when you know the right people. I've actually got a friend who does wonderful work helping folks sort out paperwork, trusts, estates, all of it. Older folks get taken advantage of so easily these days. She said it without a trace of irony, ashing her cigarette into a coffee mug on the entry table. I could put you in touch if Bellhaven's ever giving you trouble. How thoughtful, I said, and filed the sentence away without knowing yet that I'd need it. On the counter behind her, half buried under a stack of unopened mail, I caught the edge of an envelope, cream-colored, the kind of paper that costs more than it needs to. I only saw 4 words before Deborah shifted and blocked my view. Kestrel Elder Trust Serve, before the rest disappeared under a takeout menu. I didn't ask about it. Not yet. A woman learns after 30 years of triage not to spend her first move on a detail she doesn't understand. I've actually been out that way before, Deborah added, almost as an afterthought, misreading exactly what had caught my eye. Bellhaven, I mean. Visited a friend there years back. Lovely grounds. Terrible food. It has its charms, I said. That was when I heard a small, choked sound past the kitchen. I followed it without waiting for an invitation, past a sink of dishes that had clearly been growing a civilization of their own, to a narrow room off the kitchen that looked like a pantry someone had decided a 9-year-old could sleep in instead. Amara was sitting on the floor in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, holding a small stuffed rabbit with one ear stitched back on crooked my stitching from 3 Christmases ago when the first ear had come loose. Grandma Hun, she whispered, and something in my chest broke and rebuilt itself in the same half-second. I didn't get more than 2 steps toward her before a boy came barreling into the room, bigger than 9 mean around the mouth in the way children get when nobody has ever told them no and meant it. Hey, crybaby, gimme that. He grabbed for the rabbit. Amara made a small defeated sound and let it go without a fight, like she'd already learned fighting only made it worse. I crossed the room and closed my hand gently but immovably around the boy's wrist. Not a hold, not a technique, Just the quiet, absolute grip of a grown woman who has decided completely and finally that something is not going to happen. "We don't take things that aren't ours," I said. My voice was calm. It didn't need to be loud. The boy Bryce, I'd learned his name, was looked up at me with the particular shock of a child meeting an adult who isn't afraid of him for the first time in his life. His hand opened. The rabbit dropped. I let go the moment it did, crouched down and picked it up, smoothing the crooked ear before handing it back to Amara. "There you are, baby girl. Good as new." Bryce ran off toward the living room, already shouting for his mother, and I heard Renee's voice rise somewhere down the hall, sharp, defensive, though nothing close to the confrontation I'd braced for. A few minutes of hissed, furious complaint about that woman and my son and who does she think she is, and then notably nothing more. Renee, it turned out, had a great deal to say, and very little appetite to say it to my face. Deborah appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, arms crossed, cigarette gone. "You can't just come into my son's house and manhandle my grandson." "I didn't manhandle anyone," I said. "I stopped a child from bullying a 9-year-old who watched her mother get carried into an ambulance yesterday. If you'd like to discuss house rules, I'm happy to. I have several." Deborah's mouth opened, then closed. Something moved behind her eyes I wouldn't understand the shape of for another 3 weeks. Not simple anger, but the particular calculation of a woman recalculating exactly how much of a problem I was about to become. "House rules," she repeated like the words tasted bad. "Rule 1, nobody touches Amara. Rule 2, I'd appreciate the same courtesy. Rule 3, this kitchen is getting cleaned tonight because that child is not eating another meal in a house that smells like this." I lifted Amara into my arms, 9 years old and far too light for it, which was its own small horror, and carried her toward the room that would be hers for as long as I had breath to make sure of it. "We can discuss the rest once my daughter's husband gets home. Grant Ashford came home at 9:30 that night. I heard the truck before I saw it, engine too loud, tires chewing gravel that didn't need chewing. I'd gotten Amara bathed, fed, and asleep by then in a bed I'd made up myself, with sheets that actually smelled like soap. The front door didn't open so much as it got kicked. "Denise, get me a beer." He was a big man, 6-foot-something, running soft around the middle in the way of someone who used to play a sport in high school and never quite let go of the idea that he still could. His shirt was untucked, his tie hanging loose around his neck like he'd tried and failed to strangle himself with it on the drive home. He smelled like whiskey and cigarettes, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent the whole night losing. I noticed almost against my will the watch on his wrist, knew the kind of steel that catches light, even in a dim hallway, the kind of thing a man doesn't buy when he's $12,000 deep at a card table, which was the number Denise had whispered to me at the hospital like a confession. I filed that away too, next to the cream-colored envelope. 2 details that didn't fit the story he was telling. He stopped in the living room doorway and squinted at me like his eyes needed a second to process a stranger sitting in his armchair with a cup of tea. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the babysitter." "The what?" "Where's my wife?" "In the hospital." "Where you put her?" His face changed. Not shame I looked for it, and it wasn't there. What crossed his face was closer to irritation, the particular petulance of a man reminded of a consequence he hadn't planned on facing tonight. "Get out of my house." He took a step toward me, hands curling into fists. I stood. I did not step back. "No," I said. He swung a wide, drunken telegraphed thing, more momentum than aim, and I stepped inside it instead of away the way I'd been trained to 30 years ago, and had never quite let my body forget and use the arm that missed me to redirect the rest of him. He went down hard over the coffee table, which did not survive the encounter, and lay there stunned for a second before pushing himself up and coming at me again, arms wide, trying to grab rather than strike. I sidestepped, nothing dramatic, just weight and timing, and when he passed me, I drove the heel of my hand into the soft space below his ribs, hard enough to fold him in half, gentle enough that he'd be walking normally again within the hour. He went down to the floor, gasping, one hand braced against the ruined table. I did not touch him again. I did not need to. "My daughter didn't fight back," I said, standing over him while he wheezed. "I imagine she was trying to keep your daughter from watching it get worse. I don't have that particular constraint." He was still trying to find enough air to threaten me with when the police arrived 20 minutes later, his call not mine, though I hadn't stopped him from making it. The younger officer looked uncertain. The older one, a sergeant with tired eyes and a name tag that read Pierce, studied me a long moment with an expression I recognized slowly as recognition. "Ma'am, have we met?" "I don't believe so, Sergeant." "You look like my old partner's wife had a nurse who worked the VA for years." "Freeman, was it?" "That's my name." Something shifted in his face, warm and startled at once. "Colonel Freeman. You stitched up half our unit's families back when the VA clinic was still running on duct tape and volunteers." I did what needed doing. He glanced past me at Grant, still catching his breath on the floor at the wrecked coffee table at the whole sorry scene, and something settled behind his eyes that told me he already understood, in the way officers who've seen this particular pattern before always understand exactly what he was looking at. I showed him the photos on my phone. Denise's face, her arm, her neck taken that afternoon with the charge nurse's permission. He scrolled through them in silence, his jaw tightening with each one, and when he looked up at Grant, his voice had gone flat and hard in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee table. "Mr. Ashford, did you do this to your wife?" "She fell down the stairs." "Uh-huh." Pierce handed my phone back without looking away from Grant. "I'm not writing this up tonight because it sounds like your mother-in-law handled herself just fine, and I don't see a victim in this room who wants to press anything. But hear me clearly. If I get called back to this address for any reason at all, I walk in with a warrant and these photos go straight to the district attorney. Are we understood?" Grant, still on the floor, still gasping, managed a small, furious nod. Pierce tipped his hat to me on the way out. "Ma'am, sleep well." I did not particularly. But I sat in that ruined living room long after the cruiser's taillights disappeared down Millbrook Lane, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years, the specific, quiet satisfaction of a problem that had finally met someone willing to solve it properly. By the time the sun came up, the house had new rules, a broken coffee table, and I believed that morning with my whole exhausted heart, an ending. I did not yet know it was only a beginning. The days that followed took on a shape I hadn't expected, not peace exactly, but a kind of watchful quiet, the sort I remembered from fire bases the morning after, when everyone was still breathing and nobody quite believed it yet. Grant kept his distance, nursing a bruised pride, and I suspected a few bruised ribs he hadn't mentioned to anyone. Renee kept hers too, though I caught her watching me from doorways more than once, like she was trying to work out what species I belonged to. Deborah was, if anything, too pleasant, the kind of pleasant that sets a nurse's teeth on edge, because I had spent 30 years learning that people don't get sweeter right after you catch them doing something ugly. They get careful. On the 4th day, I decided the kitchen table had served its last shift as a landfill for unopened mail, and I sat down with a trash bag and enough irritation to see it through. Overdue notices. A gym membership nobody in that house had used since spring. A stack of collection letters for the same $12,000 debt. Denise had already told me about 3 different agencies chasing the same number in 3 different fonts. And then near the bottom, an envelope that didn't belong with the rest of them. Cream-colored. Heavy stock. A letterhead in a small, tasteful serif kestrel, Elder Trust Services. Underneath it, smaller still, a line about fiduciary planning and estate consultation for senior clients and their families. It wasn't addressed to Grant. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Actually, no name at all, just the house number, like it had been sent as a general inquiry or a reminder or bait. I sat with it for a long moment, and something in the back of my mind, the same something that used to flag a chart before I could say why, started tugging. A friend who does wonderful work helping folks sort out paperwork. Deborah had said the very first afternoon with a cigarette in one hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let me make a call first," Preston had said the morning my daughter was lying in an emergency room. It's a coincidence, I told myself. Deborah probably knows a dozen people in elder services. It's a small enough world. I folded the envelope in half and put it in my cardigan pocket instead of the trash bag, and I told myself that was simply tidiness. It wasn't. But I didn't know that yet, and for one more week I let myself not know it. The unease didn't leave with the mailbag. It sat with me through the next several days, small and persistent, the way a splinter sits under skin you can't quite locate. I told myself I was imagining connections that weren't there. I had spent 2 years being told in a dozen gentle ways that my judgment couldn't be trusted anymore, and some quiet, traitorous part of me wondered if this was exactly the kind of thing a woman starts seeing when she's afraid of losing her mind before she loses anything else. Then I thought about the notary stamp. I still had a copy of the power of attorney Preston had walked me through 2 years earlier. I'd never had the stomach to look at it since, but I'd kept it tucked in the bottom of the suitcase I'd carried out of Belhaven. I dug it out on the 6th night after Amara was asleep and read it properly for the first time since I'd signed it. There at the bottom of the second page was a notary seal, a name, R. Alvarez, commission number 44,219. I didn't know yet what it meant. I only knew I wanted to find out if it meant anything at all. "Grandma Han, are you doing homework?" Amara asked the next afternoon, climbing onto the stool beside me where I sat squinting at my phone like it had personally wronged me. "Something like that. Do you know how to look up a business? Find out who owns it?" She grinned, 9 years old and delighted for the first time in days to be the one who knew something. "You can search the Secretary of State website. We did it for a class project. What's it called? Kestrel Elder Trust Services." Her fingers moved faster than mine ever could. 2 minutes later, we were looking at a registration filed 11 years ago, a limited liability company registered agent listed at an address on Cordero Street. I wrote it down because some habits from 30 years of paperwork never leave a person, and because something about that address was nagging at me the same way the envelope had. I found out why 2 days later, going through the folder of admission paperwork Belhaven had handed me my very first afternoon there, the resident welcome guide, the kind of thing you skim once and never open again. Buried in the fine print of the financial services page under a paragraph about optional estate consultation was the same address, Cordero Street, the exact same suite number. I sat very still at that kitchen table for a long time. It could still be nothing. Companies share office parks. Registered agents handle 100 clients out of the same address. That's the whole point of a registered agent. I told myself that twice the way you tell yourself a shadow on an X-ray is probably nothing right up until you order the second scan. I called Sergeant Pierce. "I'm not asking you to do anything you shouldn't," I said before he could say anything at all. "I know how these things work. I just need to know if there's a public way to see what other properties a company like this is tied to." "Secretary of State filings are public record, ma'am. I can point you to the search portal. I can't go digging through anyone's private accounts for you, not without cause." "I'm not asking you to. I don't want to be imagining things is all." There was a pause, the particular pause of a man deciding whether a feeling is worth trusting. "Send me what you've got. I'll take a look at the public side of it on my own time." He called back the following evening. I remember exactly where I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of something Amara wouldn't eat no matter how I dressed it up, when my phone buzzed. Kestrel Elder Trust Services is registered as a preferred estate services vendor to 3 different facilities. Pierce said no preamble the way men who've spent 30 years delivering hard news learn to skip the runway. Belhaven's one of them. 2 others, both assisted living, both a few hours from here. All 3 list the same registered agent. I set the spoon down. "That doesn't mean anything's wrong," he added. "Vendors service multiple facilities all the time. I want to be straight with you, Colonel. This isn't evidence of anything yet." "I understand. But I'll tell you what I told my captain the first time a chart didn't add up for me. When 3 separate things line up perfectly enough to explain away individually, and you still can't sleep, that's not nothing. I didn't sleep that night either. 3 days after that call, Deborah brought me tea. She'd never brought me anything in the 2 weeks I'd been living under that roof, and she brought it now with a softness in her voice I hadn't heard from her before, a performance of contrition so careful it would have fooled someone who hadn't spent 30 years reading people for a living. "I want to apologize," she said, setting the cup in front of me, "for how things started. Chamomile should help you rest." I lifted the cup and breathed in the steam the way you're taught to before you ever drink something a stranger hands you in a war zone, and underneath the chamomile, I caught it faint bitter, unmistakable to anyone who's ever crushed a sedative into water that didn't want to dissolve it cleanly. I did not accuse her. I did not let my face change. I let my hand slip, reaching for the sugar, and the tea went sideways across the table instead of down my throat. And I apologized for my clumsy old hands with a tremor in my voice I hadn't needed to fake very hard. Not from fear, but from the particular fury of understanding all at once that this woman had decided I was worth drugging. I poured what was left into a mason jar once she'd gone, screwed the lid on tight, and added it to a small growing collection at the bottom of my suitcase. I didn't know yet what any of it would be worth. I only knew with the same certainty I'd once used to know a wound needed a surgeon and not a bandage that I was going to need it. 2 days later, Deborah left the house for what she called a hair appointment, dressed too well for a hair appointment, and in her hurry heels clicking too fast down the hallway, keys jangling the door to the small room off the master bedroom didn't quite catch. I had noticed that door before. Always closed. Always as far as I'd ever seen locked. I stood in the hallway exactly as long as it took to be certain the car was gone, and then I went in. It wasn't an office so much as a converted closet, a desk crammed under the slope of the roof, a filing cabinet, a laptop closed on top of a stack of folders. My hands moved before my conscience finished arguing with itself, because I had spent my whole life being the person who ran toward the thing everyone else ran from. And old habits don't retire just because the body around them does. The top folder held a list, names down the left column, dates beside them, dollar figures beside the dates, 4 of them running into 5, more than one running into 6. Ferris Lorraine Cedarbrook Assisted Living, Okonkwo Beatrice Ridgemont Senior Care. 2 names, 2 facilities, neither of them mine. This wasn't about my family. It never had been. My hands were shaking too hard to trust myself with anything as delicate as taking the folder itself, so I did the only sensible thing 30 years of triage had ever taught me to do under pressure. I got my phone out and photographed 3 pages as fast as my fingers would move, then put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, squared to the same crooked angle it had been sitting at, because a woman who has spent her career documenting other people's worst days does not under any circumstances forget to leave a scene the way she found it. I heard the front door open downstairs. Too soon. Far too soon for a hair appointment. I slipped back into the hallway with my heart going harder than it had in 20 years, harder than it had gone in rooms with far more obvious reasons to be afraid. I didn't know yet who was really running this, or how deep it went, or whose name was sitting somewhere in a file I hadn't reached. I was about to find out faster than I ever wanted to. Deborah's key was already in the lock when I reached the top of the stairs, and whatever was on my face must have told her something, because she stopped dead in the doorway of her own bedroom and looked at me the way you look at a fire alarm going off in a building you thought was empty. "What were you doing in my room?" There wasn't time to lie, and after that folder I found I didn't especially want to. "Lorraine Ferris," I said, "Beatrice Okonkwo. I'd like you to tell me who they are, and then I'd like you to tell me why their names are sitting in a locked room in your house next to figures with 6 numbers in them." Her face didn't crumble the way I expected. It went still instead, the particular stillness of a woman recalculating in real time exactly how much damage had already been done. "You don't understand what you're looking at." "Then help me understand." I held up my phone, the photograph still open on the screen. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a list of people being robbed by somebody who knows exactly how the system protects them from being believed." "Put that away. Who runs this Deborah?" My thumb caught the screen wrong, and the photos scrolled past the page I meant to show her, to a page I hadn't had time to actually read when I took it, hands shaking 90 seconds before I'd heard that door. A referral form. A dollar figure. And tucked into the corner a notary seal that stopped my breath before I even understood why R. Alvarez Commission number 44219. The same seal sitting at the bottom of my own power of attorney, folded in the bottom of my suitcase 2 floors below us. Then the name at the top of the page, not Ferris, not Okonkwo, Freeman Hannah Belhaven Senior Living, and beneath it on the line marked referred by a signature I would have known blindfolded because I had watched that hand sign birthday cards for 24 years. Preston Freeman. The hallway went very quiet. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that Deborah's face shifted from panic into something almost like relief. The relief of a woman realizing the worst part of this conversation is about to happen without her having to be the one who says it first. "You didn't know," she said. It wasn't a question. I couldn't make my mouth work yet. "Preston finds families like yours," Deborah said, and her voice had gone flat, almost bored the voice of someone reciting an old arrangement rather than confessing to one. He's been doing it 11 years. You were never a coincidence, Hannah. You were an opportunity he brought to me himself. I have stood over dying men in the middle of a war and kept my hands from shaking. I have delivered news no mother should ever have to hear and kept my voice level while I did it. I did not know until that moment in a stranger's hallway that a person could survive being betrayed by their own family and still forget for one full breath how to use their own hands. Then I thought of Amara asleep 2 doors down in a house that belonged to these people. My hands remembered how to work again. You have no idea how far this actually goes, Deborah said, watching me gather myself the way you'd watch a storm deciding which direction to move. You are not the first family who stood in a hallway like this thinking they'd found the whole story. You won't be the last either unless somebody actually stops us. And that has never once happened yet. I didn't answer her. There wasn't a version of that sentence I trusted myself to say out loud without the fury underneath it taking over completely, and I still had a 9-year-old asleep down the hall who needed her grandmother steady, not incinerated. So I turned and I walked down the stairs, phone still warm in my hand, and I did not look back to see Deborah's face. I had 3 weeks left before that conference room. I intended to use every hour of them. I called Preston that night after Amara was asleep, and I did not raise my voice once because I had learned a long time ago that the coldest thing a person can do to someone who's hurt them is refuse to give them the satisfaction of watching you break. I know, I said when he picked up. I know about Kestrel. I know about the 11 years. I know my name is on a piece of paper with your signature on it. The silence on the other end went on long enough that I almost hung up. Hannah. Don't, I said. Not yet. Just tell me you'll meet me. Tomorrow. I'm not calling the police tonight. I'm giving you exactly one chance to look me in the eye first. He came the next morning, parking his car at the curb instead of the driveway, like some part of him already understood he wasn't welcome past that boundary anymore. I was sitting on the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee I had no intention of drinking because my hands needed something to hold that wasn't a phone or a folder or a weapon. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. I don't know if that was true or if I was only seeing him clearly for the first time. How long were you planning it? I asked. Before Walter died, or after? After! He sat down on the step below me, elbows on his knees, not looking at me. I swear to you, Hannah, I didn't marry into this. I didn't become your family thinking I'd do this to you. I met Deborah at an elder services conference 6 years ago. We got to talking about clients, about how much falls through the cracks when nobody's watching a power of attorney closely enough. I told myself it was consulting, helping families structure trusts more efficiently. That's all it was for a long time. And then it wasn't. And then my own business started bleeding money, and Deborah had a model that worked, and I told myself I'd do it once for one client to cover what I owed and I'd stop. He finally looked up at me. I never planned on you being the client, Hannah. Not until Grant married Denise and Deborah mentioned her mother-in-law, and I heard your name and you saw an opportunity, I said, instead of a woman who raised you when your own mother couldn't. He flinched like I'd struck him, and some ugly, honest part of me was glad. I told myself you'd never have to know, that Belhaven was a nice place, that it wasn't really hurting you the way it was hurting the others. There are others. Yes. How many? I don't have the exact number. Deborah keeps the records. I stood up because I could feel something rising in my chest. I did not trust myself to sit still through, and I looked down at the boy I had once bandaged, now a 44-year-old man who had watched me get quietly erased from my own life for 2 years, and never once said a word to stop it. You isolated me, I said, so I couldn't get to Denise, didn't you? That's the part I can't, Preston. You knew what Grant was, and you let me sit in that building 40 minutes away, unable to leave without your say-so. While my daughter, I didn't know how bad it had gotten with Grant. I swear that to you. But you knew keeping me at Belhaven kept me from finding out. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. His silence was the whole answer, and it was worse than anything he could have said out loud. Get off my porch, I said, and my voice, when it finally cracked on the word my rather than anywhere else, because that was the thing I understood standing there. This had never really been about the money not for me. It was about a lifetime of believing I still belonged to myself and learning how long someone I loved had been quietly deciding I didn't. He left without another word. I sat back down on the steps and let myself cry for exactly as long as it took the coffee to go cold, and then I went inside and called Sergeant Pierce. I told Denise everything 2 days later once she was home from the hospital and steady enough to hear it properly. I had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in my head, and none of the rehearsals prepared me for the sound she made when I said Preston's name. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to a decade of small, unexplained things finally clicking into a shape she'd never let herself look at directly. "He used to send us grocery money," she said, staring at her hands. "Every few months when things got tight. I thought he was just being kind." "He was buying time," I said, making sure nobody looked too closely at either of us. She cried for a long while after that. Not for Grant, and not even entirely for herself, but for the version of the last several years where she'd believed her mother had simply grown distant, had simply stopped fighting to see her as often, when the truth was that I had been fighting the whole time and losing without ever knowing there was a war on. "You didn't do this." I told her the same way I'd told her in that hospital bed weeks before. "None of it. Not the marriage you didn't know was being watched. Not the trust you didn't know existed. You are not required to apologize for other people's choices. Not his, not theirs, not mine for taking as long as I did to see it." She nodded and didn't quite believe me yet, and I understood that some part of healing simply takes longer to arrive than the facts do. Renee moved out of the Ashford house within the month, taking Bryce with her, back to her own family 2 states over. I don't know if she ever fully understood how much of what happened in that house had nothing to do with the ordinary cruelty she'd been raised on, and everything to do with money she never saw a single dollar of. I think in the end she was exactly what she'd always seemed to be, a woman shaped hard by her mother-in-law's coldness, capable of real unkindness, but never the architect of anything larger than her own bad temper. That distinction mattered to Detective Reyes legally. It mattered to me, too, in a smaller way the day I heard through Denise that Bryce had started seeing a counselor. 10 years old is still young enough to choose a different kind of grown-up to become. What followed over the next several days was not the kind of story that makes for a satisfying scene. No dramatic confrontations, no doors kicked in. It was paperwork. It was patience. It was the unglamorous, essential work of turning a feeling into a case a district attorney could actually use. Pierce connected me with a detective from the county's financial crimes unit, a quiet, thorough woman named Detective Reyes, who took my photographs, my mason jar of drugged tea and the notary information, and turned them into something with actual legal teeth, a search warrant for the Kestrel Elder Trust Services office on Cordero Street, and within days subpoenaed banking and business records that told a story even Deborah's folder hadn't fully captured. 11 years. 7 families beyond mine, going back to the year Preston and Deborah first met at that conference. Total losses north of $3 million, siphoned through inflated consultation fees, manufactured trust arrangements, and in at least 2 cases outright forged authorizations from residents whose families had no idea their loved ones' signatures had ever been used at all. I was not the biggest case Detective Reyes had ever built. I understood that reading through the summary she eventually shared with me. In some ways, I was one of the smaller ones. That knowledge did not comfort me the way I thought it might. It made the whole thing heavier, instead the realization that somewhere out there were 6 other families who'd spent years believing their own confusion, their own guilt, their own grief, had been the whole story when really they'd simply been standing too close to something enormous to see the shape of it. Detective Reyes came to the rental house twice that first week, laying documents across Denise's kitchen table with the particular calm of someone who has done this so many times. The horror of it no longer shows on her face, though I suspected watching her that it still lived somewhere underneath. "Most people don't want to look at all of it," she told me the second visit when I asked to see the full case file instead of just the summary. "You don't have to. I've spent my whole life looking at things other people couldn't stand to," I said. "I'm not going to stop now on the one file that's actually mine." She didn't argue with me again after that. She simply started bringing 2 copies of everything. Loretta Simmons, an elder law attorney Pierce's wife had used years earlier for her own mother, took my case that same week. She filed to have my power of attorney revoked on the grounds of undue influence and financial exploitation, with Detective Reyes's early findings as supporting evidence, and petitioned separately on Denise's behalf for an emergency protective order and the beginning of a divorce that named financial coercion alongside the physical abuse. Grant, for his part, was charged separately, assault on the strength of Denise's medical records and the photographs I'd taken that first day at Mercy General. Whatever role his mother's operation had played in the pressure that shaped him, Loretta was clear about one thing, and I made myself remember it every time some small, tired part of me wanted to soften the edges of what he'd done. Pressure explains a man. It does not excuse what he chooses to do with his hands. A journalist named Vivian Marsh called me that same week, not long after the warrant became public record. She'd been quietly investigating Kestrel Elder Trust for 4 months already, she told me after a tip from a woman in another state whose grandmother had lost her house to a strikingly similar trust restructuring. She hadn't been able to prove anything solid until Detective Reyes's warrant gave her something to build on. "I'm not asking you to go on camera," Vivian said the first time we spoke. "I'm asking whether you'd be willing to let the other families know they're not the only ones. Some of them have spent years thinking it was their own fault for trusting the wrong person." I thought about the folder in Deborah's converted closet and the 2 names I hadn't recognized, and how frightened I'd have been to learn I was one name on a list nobody outside that house would ever see. "Yes," I said, "tell them." The arrest happened 3 weeks after I'd walked out of Bellhaven for what I hadn't yet known would be the last time. Detective Reyes called me that morning. They had enough now. The warrant, the financial record statements from 2 of the other families Vivian had helped locate to move. Preston and Deborah, it turned out, were meeting that very afternoon at the Kestrel office on Cordero Street, the same address I'd spent 3 weeks learning to read like a map. "You don't have to be there," Reyes told me. "Most people in your position don't want to be." "I want to be there," I said. I sat in that small conference room, burnt coffee cheap carpet cleaner, the particular smell of an office nobody had ever really intended to make comfortable, while Detective Reyes and 2 uniformed officers, Sergeant Pierce among them, moved through the front room. I heard raised voices before I saw either of them. Preston's tight and panicked. Deborah's still trying even then to sound like a woman being terribly inconvenienced rather than a woman finally caught. They brought both of them into the room where I was already sitting, because Reyes had asked me gently if I wanted the chance to say anything before they were formally taken in, and I had said yes before she'd finished the question. Preston wouldn't look at me. Deborah sat with her hands folded, still performing composure, even now, even here. I laid the folder Reyes had printed for me open on the table, just enough to see the names typed down the left margin. More names than I'd let myself fully picture until that moment. 11 years, I said. That's how long the 2 of you have been doing this. So I have one question before anyone in this room says another word. How many of us were there before me? Neither of them answered. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. I looked at Preston, my late husband's son, a boy I had once bandaged a skinned knee for a man I had trusted enough to sign my whole life over to, and I waited. He still didn't look up. I had already learned by then most of what I was going to learn. 11 years. 7 families beyond mine. $3 million and more spread thin across bank accounts and manufactured trusts, and the quiet compounding cruelty of people who had learned exactly how invisible the elderly become to everyone, except the people trying to rob them. I hadn't come to that room for information. I had come so that the last thing Preston Freeman heard before they read him, his rights, was my voice steady in a room he could not talk his way out of. Detective Reyes read them both their rights 11 minutes later. I watched them lead Deborah out first, chin still lifted, still performing for an audience that no longer existed. Preston went second, and just before they reached the door, he finally looked back at me. I don't know what he was hoping to find on my face. I hope for his sake and mine that he didn't find it. Denise's divorce was finalized 11 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning neither of us will ever forget for how ordinary it felt after everything. She got full custody of Amara. Grant pled guilty to assault in exchange for a sentence that felt to me like both too little and exactly as much as the system was built to give. and I have made my peace mostly with the gap between those two things. I heard secondhand through Denise that Grant completed a court-mandated batterer's intervention program during his probation, and that he'd asked twice to see Amara, and been told both times that the answer was hers to give when she was older, not his to request now. I don't know if he's changed. I've stopped needing to know. Some doors are allowed to simply stay closed regardless of what's eventually on the other side of them. Deborah's sentencing hearing came 14 months later, on a cold morning in a courtroom that smelled faintly of the same industrial carpet cleaner as that office on Cordero Street, which felt to me like a small and deliberate cruelty from whoever schedules these things. I gave a victim impact statement. I had written 4 different versions in the weeks leading up to it, and thrown out all 4, and ended up saying something much shorter than any of them standing at a podium with my hand steady for the first time in longer than I could remember. I spent 2 years being told I couldn't be trusted with my own life, I said. I want the record to reflect that I have never once in 67 years needed anyone's permission to survive something. I only needed the chance. Deborah did not look at me while I spoke. Preston, seated for his own hearing 2 weeks later, would not look at me either, though. By then I had stopped needing him to. The judge sentenced Deborah to 11 years, a number nobody in that courtroom said out loud, though I noticed Detective Reyes catch my eye when it was read, and I understood she'd noticed it too. Preston received 9, along with restitution orders that will likely outlive both of us before they're fully paid. Neither sentence returned a single dollar to the families who needed it fastest, which is its own kind of injustice built into a system that was never really designed with people like us in mind. But neither of them will run this on anyone else again either, and some days that has to be enough. My power of attorney was formally revoked the same month the warrant was served. I signed the paperwork myself in my own handwriting at my own kitchen table in the small rental house Denise and I found together 3 streets from Amara's new school. I still think about the other 6 families more than I probably should. Vivian's article ran 8 weeks after the arrest, and within a month 4 of them had come forward blinking in a kind of daylight. I recognized the particular disorientation of people realizing their private shame had never been theirs to carry alone. Lorraine Ferris called me herself the 2nd week of that month. 81 years old, sharp as a tack, furious. In a way I recognized immediately because it was the same fury I'd been carrying since a hallway in a house on Millbrook Lane. They told my son I was getting confused, she said, her voice shaking with something that wasn't confusion at all. Confused. I ran a bookkeeping business for 40 years, and they told my own son I couldn't be trusted to sign my own checks. I know. I said because I did in a way very few people ever could have. How did you get out? I didn't wait for anyone to let me, I told her. And neither should you. We talked for an hour that first call, and most weeks since. She reminds me of Ruth Ann Colby in the way certain women who've survived enough of the world start to sound like each other regardless of where they came from. The same clipped patience, the same refusal to be spoken over twice. I used a portion of my restored assets to help Lorraine and one other family retain attorneys of their own. It felt less like generosity than like paying down a debt I hadn't known I owed until I understood how close I'd come to being just another name nobody outside that converted closet ever found. Amara sleeps in a room with stars painted on the ceiling now. Denise is doing one long Saturday with a step stool and more glow-in-the-dark paint than either of us had any business buying. The rabbit with the crooked ear still sits on her pillow every night. She laughs more than she used to. Not fully, not yet, not the way a 9-year-old should be able to laugh without having to relearn how first, but more. There was a Tuesday 4 months after we moved into the rental house when Amara asked if Bryce's old room, the pantry she still called it that without meaning anything cruel by it just accuracy, was the kind of room some children have to live in too. I told her the truth that yes, some children do, and that it was never ever their fault when they did. Is it my fault I used to be scared all the time? She asked. No, baby girl. That was never yours to carry either. She thought about that for a long moment, in the serious, deliberate way she thinks about everything now, and then went back to her homework like the conversation had cost her nothing at all, though I understood watching her that it had cost her everything, and that this was simply what healing looked like at 9 years old. Carrying something enormous for exactly as long as you need to, and then setting it down and doing your spelling homework because some part of you has finally decided correctly that you're allowed to. Sergeant Pierce retired 8 months after the arrest, 31 years almost to the day since he'd first put on the uniform. He came by the rental house the week before his last shift, still in uniform, and stood on the porch looking almost shy about it, which was not an expression I'd have guessed that particular face knew how to make. "Wanted to say thank you properly," he said. "Cases like this don't usually go anywhere. Families don't usually have anybody in their corner who knows how to make people listen. You listened first, Sergeant. That's the part that mattered." "Roland," he said. "I believe we've earned first names by now." We had coffee on the porch for an hour. He told me about the fishing cabin he and his wife were finally going to finish renovating. I told him about Amara's spelling tests. For that hour, neither of us mentioned Kestrel Elder Trust Services even once, which felt like its own small, hard-won kind of peace. Some evenings, I sit on our small back porch with a cup of tea I trust completely, because I make it myself now, and I think about Bellhaven and Ruth Ann Colby, who still calls me every Sunday to report on the state of Thursday Bridge, and about the 26 years I spent believing the hardest thing I would ever survive had already happened somewhere with sand instead of carpet. I was wrong about that, but I was also wrong about something else. The thing Elijah Banks tried to tell me the day I called in a favor I'd been saving for 30 years. "Whatever's waiting for you over there, you go in like the woman I remember." I did eventually. It just took me a little longer than either of us expected to remember how. They spent 11 years convinced no one was paying close enough attention to see what they'd built in the dark. It took me 3 weeks to prove them wrong.